the live recording, and for some reason, it's not going to me. It's not switching over.
It's not my fault.
It's not Dr. B's fault, because I'm on speaker view, and it's on Dr. Baltes.
I see you, Easton.
Yeah, cool. All right. Hi, I'm Easton Selby. I am Associate Dean of the Edwards College of Humanities and Fine Arts, and welcome to another Cultural Arts at a Distance live event. Today we're talking to Dr. Elizabeth Baltes, an Assistant Professor of Art History. She received her BA in Political Science from Louisiana State University and her MA and PhD in Art History, specifically Greek Art and Archaeology from Duke University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of sculpture, politics, identity, and public space in the ancient Greek world. However, she has been conducting recent research in contemporary American public sculpture. On the side, because that's not enough, she also conducts scholarly work in digital historical reconstruction. Her work has been published in multiple venues, including the American Journal of Archaeology and Hesperia. Her research has been generously supported by grants from the Archaeological Institute of America, and more recently, the National Endowment for the Humanities through a highly competitive summer stipend. Side note, she's also a competitive power lifter and Olympic lifter. So she's a very intimidating individual, both academically, and she could beat me up. And, and I brought my smart glasses so I could carry a conversation with Dr. Baltes. So Elizabeth, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today? Give us a little bit of background of your research, and then let's go through your work.
Well, basically, I study portrait monuments in the Greek and Roman world, mostly in ancient Greece, but Romans set up portraits in ancient Greece too. And I'm really interested in the way people were representing themselves and their identities in different places and in different times. And I'm interested in the way that sort of statues filled the spaces in between buildings. When people tend to imagine the ancient world, it tends to be a lot of architecture. And of course, there's really beautiful, wonderful architecture, but in between those buildings and all of those empty spaces that we tend to see on plans, those spaces were filled with portrait monuments. I think in numbers that's really difficult for us to imagine. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of bronze, life-size statues just filling these public spaces.
So how did you find yourself getting into this kind of research? Because I mean, you have a background in political science, and I see the evident ties between the history of sculpture in ancient Greece, and then especially in our current climate as well. So how did you sort of find yourself as an art historian studying this work?
It was a really circuitous path, actually. As you mentioned, I, as an undergraduate, I majored in political science and really in ancient political theory. And when I decided to go to grad school a little bit later, I took some time off and worked some absolutely unrelated jobs, which I think was great, including purchasing explosives for the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, in case you didn't know that about me. And then I found myself visiting a museum in DC one day and looking at these statues. And I had the thought immediately, I was like, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to study. And I found myself really interested in, the sort of intersections between or among history and politics and visual representation. Because so much of the monument isn't actually visible on the monument. There are all kinds of things going on behind the scenes. A lot of these monuments are politically motivated. And so there are some really interesting ties between, sort of what I studied as an undergraduate and then what I've been doing since then. And then when I was working on my dissertation, which was thinking about these sort of ways that people represent themselves socially and politically through statue monuments, it's really frustrating because so much of the evidence that we have for the ancient world is fragmentary. A lot of the bronze statues themselves we don't have anymore because they tended to get melted down, right? Bronze is an intrinsically valuable material. And so later on, when the identity of that person doesn't matter anymore, they tend to get melted down into something more useful. So we don't have a lot of the statues. And then, the bases on which they stood are kind of scattered or reused. And And, people, because statues were so commonplace, we don't always have people talking about the processes behind them. And so I got really interested in thinking about some modern statue landscapes as a way to maybe recover some of that background material. And so I started thinking about, for example, Monument Avenue in Richmond, which has become a really timely topic. And thinking about the kinds of documentation and what was going on and how location was being negotiated and how inscriptions were being negotiated. And it's certainly not a one-for-one. You can't just take what's going on in a contemporary landscape and sort of impose that onto the ancient world. But I think it helps highlight the kinds of things that are going on behind the scenes of statue monuments that we just don't have evidence for in the ancient world. Sorry, I think that was a really long answer to your question.
No, I mean, I think that's a great answer to my question, because there are a lot of, I think about myself growing up in the South. Like we grew up not far from each other. I grew up in Mississippi, you grew up in Louisiana. But I remember thinking as a child going to visit the Vicksburg National Military Park, which is a Civil War memorial, and seeing the amount of portraits, statuary that is around that space, both on the Union side and the Confederate side, and the monumentality of that and the impact of that on like the general populace I always found that to be really fascinating.
Yeah.
I never quite understood like what that meant as a kid, and it wasn't really articulated well. And it may be because I just didn't know how to ask those certain questions. But it is interesting how temporary a lot of these are, because even thinking about like right now, the statues that are being toppled around the world because of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like I'm curious about what's going to be next for these, because like even some of those, like you're talking about, historically a lot of these don't exist. They get melted down due to change and other things. Yeah. I'm curious about like your research now. We're probably going to see similar research in the next like 40, 50 years. We won't. I might be dead, but likely. So somebody else. So, all right. So how do you, when you're investigating monuments that are non-existent, like how do you go about your process for research? Because I know that you're talking about the science behind it, like how it's done, the places that it existed or once lived. Like what is your process?
So I think it depends on the particular place and the particular questions that I'm trying to answer. So even if you don't have the actual statue anymore, so let's assume we're talking about a bronze statue, which was sort of like the material of choice if you're going to set up a portrait statue of someone. So even if you don't have the statue, let's say you have the base. So in the actual process of setting up a bronze statue, there are essentially holes carved in the top of that base into which the feet of the statue, assuming it's a statue of a man, will be set. So when they pry the statue out, it leaves like footprints in the top of the base. So you can tell whether or not it was represented a man or a woman. You can tell whether it was an adult or a child, because we actually do have portrait statues of children. You get these tiny little footprints. So you can recover some information that way. If you have the inscription, it might tell you the name of the person represented, some of their sort of kinship or family networks, why they were being honored, by whom they were being honored. And in the ancient world, portrait statues can be set up by the city, what we would think of as sort of a public honorific portrait statue, or they can be private, set up by family or friends. And this is sort of an interesting distinction between, what happened in the ancient world and what happens today, because again, I'm sort of thinking about Monument Avenue, the sort of forces, the generative forces behind the monument are not always made apparent on the base, and in fact are usually sort of hidden, so that the monument comes across as sort of like spontaneously from the entire community, when that's not at all what happened historically, when there are very specific sort of politically motivated forces at work, such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who did like door-to-door fundraising to raise money to put that monument up. Another interesting difference is that today we have sort of a taboo against setting up statues of living people. But that actually happened all the time in the ancient world. So like you'd set up a statue of your wife and your kids, and then your wife would set up a statue of you. So you could have this entire like family network displayed on a base. Now, so we don't have those statues anymore most of the time. So that's where digital historical reconstruction can come in handy. And quite often, I'm not trying to like figure out exactly what that statue looked like, but as far as we can, right? Depending on like how the feet are positioned, you can tell sort of how the person was standing, the basic size of the person. And the Greeks were pretty formulaic. They had a few sort of statue types that they liked, you know, a man dressed in a certain way to represent a certain thing. And so I can sort of put these statues back on their bases and visualize these lost landscapes. So that's where, and it's, you know, that's where digital reconstruction can come in handy to really help us recover some of this information.
So
again, really long answer.
That's good. And like, I really love the idea of the lost landscape. Like there's something really fascinating about that, because in my head, like visually, like I'm a photographer and I photograph landscapes inherently with a lot of my work. And I love the idea of, you know, something that's once lost is now found again. And, you know, in this virtual environment. So, and that's a part of your pedagogy as well too, like, you know, both research and then teaching in the classroom. So here's my question then. So of the virtual landscape, the reconstruction, is that a lot of research is now starting to see like the emergence of, or the, I guess it is the intersection of technology within historical research. So like, how do you include that? Like, this is a sidebar into the classroom. So like, what is that? Do you find that that helps students have a better understanding for the ancient world?
I do. And I think it just makes them ask questions that they wouldn't normally ask, right? Because you have to, like when you're trying to reconstruct something, you can't just sort of passively read something. It really makes you engage with it. So for example, one digital project I have students undertake is to reconstruct a really complicated sanctuary complex, right? So it includes like a temple and it's multiple levels. It's sort of built into a hillside. But when you look at the two-dimensional plans, they're really well, not misleading, they're just really difficult to read and understand. Whereas when you see the building in 3D, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. So they're rebuilding, you know, lots of rooms, and they're trying to figure out how things connect and where staircases have to be. And then even simple questions like, what does the roof line look like? Because roofs were often made of wood, so we don't have them. So they're really trying to figure out how the space looked in a way that if they were just reading an article, they would just sort of like, oh, who cares about roofs? Like just sort of skim right past that.
Cool. So I want to add and throw this out there that since we are live on Facebook and Instagram, if anybody that's watching us has questions, to please ask that question, and we will make sure it gets in the chat function, and Dr. Baltes will field those questions.
Well, to the best of my ability.
She might deny the question. She might say, I don't want to answer that question. Anything is possible. All right. So you have a book project that you're working on that is the dedication display of portrait statues in Hellenistic Greece. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, where it's going, and like the research that's coming around that space?
Yeah, so that book project is coming out of my dissertation. And so I'm thinking about a few major sites in Greece, but sort of from a regional level, because if we think about what's happening in like one particular city at one particular time, okay, well, that gives us some information. But I'm really interested in understanding, again, getting at this idea of how people communicate identity through portrait monuments. I'm really interested in how they might be doing different things in different places. So for example, in Athens, right, we have people setting up portrait monuments, but Athenians were also really active in setting up portrait statues on a sacred island called Delos. And so I'm looking at how Athenians are sort of behaving at Athens and then behaving at Delos, and they're doing things a bit differently. And I'm finding the same thing is happening in other parts of Greece too, where people might be doing certain things closer to home. And then when they branch out a little bit farther, it looks a little bit different. So why is that? What are they getting out of the sort of different dedication habits? So that's that book project. And I have to say it was really fun. In 2012, when I was doing sort of the first like deep dive into research for this, I spent 6 weeks driving around Greece. It was my first time driving a standard transmission car, really. Didn't always go as planned. And so I went from site to site. I wasn't in any place longer than, 3 days or so. So I really got to see so much of Greece and encountered some wonderful people. And like that was sort of the basis for everything that has come out of this particular project.
So is this also wrapped into your NEH summer stipend, or is that a secondary project?
That's a different book project. Yes, I'm insane. I'm doing two book projects at once. So the book project that I applied for the NEH funding for is also about portrait monuments, but specifically about portrait statues from the Athenian Agora, which is the marketplace of the ancient city. And it was one of the most prestigious sites where you could set up a portrait statue in ancient Athens. And the excavations have been ongoing for about a century in this site. And there is just, I can't even describe how much sculpture there is to go through. But the portraits haven't been published since the 1950s, the early 1950s. And the scholar who published them was really looking at portrait heads because that's the easiest thing to identify as a portrait. So she left out a lot of information. And of course, a lot's been found since she published that. And we have more to compare it to since then. So we're really re-examining everything. And it's a huge project. And I say we because I'm part of a team of 5 people, scholars from Duke University, from UNC Chapel Hill, from Creighton University. And so last summer we went to Greece and we worked for about 6 weeks, just going through sculptural fragments, figuring out, is that a portrait? Is that a portrait? Looking at bodies, really, and like even smaller pieces like hands and feet, although that gets a little tricky in identifying whether or not it belonged to a portrait. And so we still have more that we need to go through, and that has to happen on site. And it really needs to happen with us together so we can talk about these things. And so I applied for an NEH summer stipend to fund my research trip to Greece this summer, which of course is not happening, but that's okay. They're letting me defer to next summer. So we'll go to Greece and we'll sort of pick up where we left off, although we actually are meeting through Zoom a couple of times a week to sort of do the remote work that we can do. So we're in the early phases of that project. There's a lot to do. It's really sort of a massive undertaking, which is why there are 5 of us.
So you're talking about like multiple long-term projects. So it's interesting to see sort of, I was department chair when you got hired, and it's been interesting to really see your development over that time. So when do you think that your first book project's going to come to fruition?
Well, the idea was that I would sort of finish revising the manuscript this summer and that it would go out for peer review, hopefully this fall. We'll see if I can stick to that timeline or not. And then the Agora portrait project, we're hoping to have finished the fieldwork by 2024.
Well, congratulations. We have our first question. First question, and it's from one of your colleagues, Ryan Bitzagai. And he's asking, if these found fragments are not part of a portrait sculpture, what type of sculpture would they be from?
Great question, Ryan, and thanks. So the Greeks set up statues of all kinds of people. So it could be a god or a goddess. It depends on the size, right? So if you're looking at, for example, a giant foot like this big, which I saw last summer, when we get something like oversized like that, it suggests that it may be a deity or maybe a Roman emperor. Sometimes they had colossal portrait statues made of themselves. So the size does give us an indication. But there were a lot of portraits. And sometimes, when you have a hand or a foot, it's not always possible to tell whether that comes from an Aphrodite or from just a female portrait.
That's a good question. So you also have another question from Rebecca Bennett that is, do you need a research assistant to travel with you next summer?
As long as you can fund yourself.
I was going to respond to Rebecca that, sorry, that's me. I'm the one that's going on that trip. That's documented through photographs. I'm not sure.
The more the merrier.
But I mean, Rebecca can go at my place. It's totally fine. Okay.
You can take turns.
You know what? That's a good option. So, all right, so with everything else that's going on, I don't want to like really shift the subject too much, but it's interesting that, I mean, you're talking about the intersections of sculpture and politics. Like, this is an incredibly fascinating moment in history right now when like we're seeing sculptures topple, even Monument Avenue lost.
Last night, Jefferson Davis.
Yeah, and then we had Edward Colston in Bristol.
Yep.
And then Robert Montgomery, Alabama. It's happening all over the place. So what is your, as a historian that's researching, this is your topic happening in a contemporary time. Like, what do you think about this?
I mean, I think it's
a question, by the way. So
come back to that in just a second, because I have to say, I think especially at a moment like this, it is so important to understand the longer historical context of what's happening. As long as portrait statues have been being set up, they have been taken down for various reasons, a lot of them political. One of my favorite examples are the statue riots in Antioch, when the Roman emperor imposed some additional taxes, and the people didn't like this, and they pulled down his statue and the statues of his family and dragged them through the streets. You can sound familiar? Think about the portrait statues of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the most famous example, of course, was pulled down by Americans, but all over Iraq, actually, Iraqi citizens were pulling down statues of Saddam Hussein and dragging them through the streets. So portrait statues make for really big symbols. And I think when people don't have recourse to the official mechanisms, right? Because traditionally, like, statues are incredibly expensive to set up and take down, by the way, but they're incredibly expensive. And if you're a marginalized community who don't have the sort of political resources or the financial resources to set up, a monument that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, what do you do?
Yeah. So we've gotten a couple of questions. I'm going to skip to another colleague's question and we'll go to the original question. But there's a question about thinking about the debates about what to do with removed Confederate statues. What did the ancient Greeks do with those sculptures when they were removed?
It depends. So sometimes they were melted down if they're bronze. Although we do have some examples where they're just discarded. And those were, it seems, especially politically motivated, where we have like parts of a bronze statue of perhaps a not so popular person thrown down a well. We know this also happened with statues of Nero. They were sort of taken down and thrown into the Tiber River, which was the treatment of criminals, the bodies of criminals. But sometimes they're just reinscribed as a new person. But yeah, in situations like this, where it's more politically motivated, they were discarded or melted down into something else.
So we're fielding some complicated questions. So I appreciate you listening and participating in this. So there's a follow-up to the question about what to do with the Confederate statues. So the question comes from Armand Means. In your opinion, this is total opinion, the need of the role of the Confederate statues, do you feel they have a place in another venue?
I think that's really tough. I can't, as someone who studies historical statues, and everything I know about what's happened is it's okay if they go away. Like, you don't have to sort of protect them. Like, they're statues, they're not historical documents. They're not neutral, right? There's always an agenda. There's always a relationship between the person being honored and who is doing the honoring. Like, I honestly, I'm not sure I can think of a good venue. Well, I don't know. That's not exactly true. I read about a museum exhibition years ago at this point that put together statues that had been the victims of iconoclasm. So statues of like Lenin and Stalin, right, in pieces. And they displayed them in pieces. Sort of this record of like actually documenting the shift in public opinion. And I think that is something kind of interesting. Like, wouldn't it be sort of fascinating to look at like the Confederate monuments that have been pulled down and are now in sort of like twisted, crumpled forms, like to talk about how, right? Because I think dialogue is important, right? Talk about how public opinion has changed and right, why the statue now looks the way it does.
So that's a really interesting sort of twist back to Ryan Bitzigai's question about the fragments of what was left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And like it actually, that's a really good segue into another question that is, what has been your favorite discovery over the course of doing your work?
Well, that's a tiny question. I think that was from Liz. Thanks, Liz. You know, I think one of the most fun aspects, I don't know if this has been like my favorite discovery, but one of the most fun aspects has actually been to go back and relook at statues that were studied in the 50s, and just think about like the language that was used to describe them, and just sort of think about how even we as scholars have sort of changed our approach. For example, the way statues of women were described in, let's just say, perhaps more harsh terms than statues of men in terms of like aging. So that's just been really interesting to rethink.
So, all right, with digital historical reconstruction, you know, and I'm just like through my head, I'm going through the questions, like both of the research that you do, the contemporary conversation or the current conversation about things. And like, I'm fascinated by the idea of looking at a comparison and contrast of like the historical context of discarded statues and the contemporary context of discarded statues, and like how everything is intertwined in and with itself. I don't know. I mean, that's just, I'm thinking out loud because I'm trying to wrap my head around all of because your research spans so much.
Yeah.
And so, but they're also so linked together that like there's so much potential for growth and change within that space that it seems like your research could just continue forever.
Yes, I see a long line stretching out before me. I mean, I think because of my background in political science, right, I'm interested in these sort of bigger questions. And yes, I'm particularly interested in the ancient world and how that works. But I think we gain more by understanding these things in relation to what's happening now, right? Learning from history. And I think, right, we can learn more about the ancient world by understanding what's going on today. These two things work together in a really illuminating way.
Yeah, well, I mean, we should be reflecting on what's happened in history so we can move forward as a society, you know, and that should be the thought, maybe.
I mean, I think about this actually with like sort of, I guess you'd call it like cultural vandalism of Confederate monuments, right? Even short of like pulling them down, but when they're spray painted, when they're tagged with graffiti, the Romans did that. Like the Romans would actually hang like insulting placards on statue monuments of people that were politically unpopular or that certain communities didn't approve of, right? And it's again about giving those marginalized communities who might not have the ability to sort of set up a statue of their own, right? It's about like, okay, so how are those communities, how are their voices heard, right? How are those communities made visible within a system that's designed really based on money and power?
That's interesting. Yeah. So, all right. It seems like, have you sort of grappled with how, like our understanding of ancient monuments, I need to think about how to phrase this. But it's, what can we learn from how monuments have been discarded over time, changed, altered, kept? Like, what can we as a current society learn from that?
I mean, I think that it's okay to change our minds, I think is the biggest thing. You know, this happened in the ancient world all the time. You know, for various political reasons, you might set up a statue of a king to sort of curry favor. But then, when you're beholden to this particular person. But then when the situation changes and you no longer feel like you have to sort of ingratiate yourself with that person, it's okay to take that statue down. It's really okay to change our minds. And I think it's also important to really think about what a portrait monument is. It is literally placing that person on a pedestal. And we have a really wonderful inscription that tells us what portrait monuments were supposed to do in the ancient world, right? They were setting these statues up for all to see and for all to emulate for all time, right? It's not just neutral, right? These portrait statues are really exemplars of civic or moral behavior. And if we find out something about someone or we change our minds about someone, it's okay if the statue comes down.
Well, I know that in art, we talk about how objects are sacred and then they're not sacred. There's a certain point where in art, we can't get too close to our own work, and that it is just an object. And there's a point where you can let go of it.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because sculptures, public sculptures, portrait sculptures, like those are portrait monuments. I mean, it is art. And so I know that a lot
there were people who would definitely debate you on that point.
I know. And everything is up for debate, right? And that's why we have these conversations, because we are trying to invite debate to a degree. And so with questions from our viewers and other folks. But they are also there with an intent, but so is art. There is a point, it's interesting to think about the idea of the public sculpture, portrait sculpture, like bronze. It's meant to last forever. It's supposed to have a greater impact, but things do change. Time changes, perceptions change. And sometimes things just have to come down and then being left to history. So for other people to come back and do more research, more NEH summer stipends, things like that.
Or digital historical reconstruction.
There it is. Yeah. So, all right. So how do you, this is the breadth of your research is expansive. Like it is contemporary, it's historical. I'd like to switch to the classroom. Like, how do you talk about this in the classroom?
Which aspect of this?
Well, any of it. So, you do, you also you teach in art history, but you also teach in digital culture and design.
Yeah.
And in some capacities, and you also teach in the graduate programs at Mal's. I believe you've taught a couple of Mal's classes. So, your research is expansive. So what is it like when you're talking to students, and let's talk about digital reconstruction.
Okay.
So how do you address changes in society and having kids or give kids context to the work that they're actually creating? And you kind of hinted at that with roof lines, this was likely shaped this way based on these historical documents. But, we're talking about reshaping and recontextualizing culture.
So one of the things I think that you kind of brought up in what you just said, right? This idea of documentation. I think a lot of students, when they get interested in digital technologies, it's about sort of the flash, right? What it can do. And I think that when students are playing something like, for example, Assassin's Creed, these are really compelling, visually engulfing, three-dimensional landscapes, right? Immersive landscapes. And it's really easy to sort of get caught up in that and to just, it makes you want to believe it, right? So when you see these beautiful, historical reconstructions of different places, right? Automatically, I think you're just sort of drawn in and you just want to believe it. But so one of the things that I work really hard with students is about documenting, right? Yes, it's okay for it to be pretty, but it has to be transparent. Someone has to understand, if you're talking about roof lines, why did you make the decision that you made? How certain are you? And how do you represent uncertainty to an audience? Especially if your audience, is a sort of a public audience who might not have the sort of specialized education related to that thing. How do you make your research and your decisions transparent to a larger audience? So that's something that we're always sort of working towards, right? Because sometimes a lot of this is an educated guess, right? It is based on fragmentary information and we do the best we can. But I think especially with digital technologies, it's really important to be critical of how you're using them. So yeah, that's definitely one thing that we get at in my class.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, I'm not a gamer, but I'm very familiar with the Assassin's Creed games, primarily because of my understanding is they try to give as much historical accuracy to a lot of the stuff that they've done, whether it was going through, I think it was Rome in one of the games, and then they've also been in Egypt too.
Greece now, Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Oh, interesting. All right.
Also, I'm not a gamer. Let me disclaimer.
I might actually have to pick up a PlayStation, and so I don't know that would go over well, but I might have to do that to check this out. But I mean, it has been interesting to see sort of how history is really injecting itself into culture in a variety of different ways to give very specific experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, art history does that too. It's recontextualizing what once was in a different form and communicating it in different ways. So, all right, we're at about, we're almost at the 40-minute mark. We're getting really close. So
sorry, everybody.
No, it's getting there. So with that said, what would you like to share with where your research is going, or something that we haven't talked about? Because I know that, usually in this process, we have talking points, things that we're trying to hit. Like, what is it that you would like to talk about that we haven't discussed already?
Sorry, my brain is a jumble after everything we've actually talked about. It was sort of like a sprint through my work.
That's what we do. And
yeah.
we're trying to match that up. Your hair is very sculptural. You have way more than I do.
So I think just in terms of like sort of going back to connecting the digital reconstruction with my own work, I think it's really important. I mean, there are certainly people who are better at digital reconstruction than I am. I sort of know the basics. I know enough to do the kinds of things that I need to do. But for me, it's not just about sort of the finished product and presenting that to people. It's about actually using it to ask questions as I go and to figure stuff out. Because when you're looking at a 2D plan, for example, the relationships among different buildings or statues, it can be very misleading when you're looking at it in 2D. For example, like if there's a building and a statue base and you're trying to figure out how much space is in between them on a plan, it's like, oh yeah, you could definitely walk in between that. But when you actually build it up from the plan in 3 dimensions, you're like, oh no, you can't actually walk there. It cuts off that sort of passageway. So for me, it helps me it's part of my process, and it helps me ask questions and answer questions. Like, how does a space change over time, right? When you look at a map today, it's a single point in time. Well, how did it get there, right? What did it look like 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And in digital historical reconstruction, you can ask those kinds of questions and actually show change over time, which I think is a really important component of understanding ancient spaces.
Yeah, I would even add that the change in contemporary spaces related to like current events and what's actually happening is going to be fascinating to see, like, the next couple of years. And like, I'm really curious to see what happens with Monument Avenue.
I was thinking the same thing.
Between the Confederate Statuary, Arthur Ashe, like all of this other kind of stuff, like we're going to see a major shift in how space is utilized or altered or changed. And so it's going to be really fascinating. And and right now, like, I can't help but also think about too, like, back to an early point that I made, thinking about national military parks that we have that are related to the Civil War, and that we have like 2 different sides that are usually represented. How is that going to be altered? Will it be altered? Like, will it be changed based on, current events? I don't know. I guess it's all to be determined. It's all speculative.
Yeah, I mean, this history is actually unfolding right now. And I think how we look at it in 10 years, is going to be really different than how we're looking at it and imagining it now.
Yeah, and I think that actually, we have another question real quick, but I do think that, with our contemporary spaces that have monuments, statues, portrait statues, and so forth, could lend itself to having a better understanding through 3D modeling. So we have a question: how has 3D modeling changed your work?
In many ways, it slowed it down. Because you're not just trying to sort of master the scholarship, you're also trying to sort of master a technology as well. And yeah, there have definitely been moments when I want to throw my computer out of a window. My students always have this experience too. It's not just me, it's everyone. But I think 3D technologies like modeling spaces in the ancient world has really allowed me to ask different questions. I did not go into graduate school really thinking anything about sort of digital humanities. It all started with a course that I took like at the end of my first year in graduate school. And it really changed the trajectory of my scholarship because I realized, hey, there are these questions that I can ask now that I couldn't ask before.
Nice. So we're getting really close to time. So do you have any questions for me? Or would you like to turn this around? Because, I mean, we've kind of been going back and forth about thoughts, related to your research, things like that. So I didn't know if you had any other questions, like things that you would like to pose. Because I mean, it's interesting that, if you look at our thread that's online, there's some really interesting opinionated questions. And so, yeah.
Wow, Easton, you're really putting me on the spot.
That's my job.
So what do you think, right, since we're talking about like how landscapes are actually much more sort of ephemeral and temporary than they initially come across, like what do you think is the relationship of that to photography, right, with the kind, like with the way you try to document spaces? Like how do you like the way I try to demonstrate change over time, like can you do that with photography, or is it just like a snapshot? Is it just like a moment in time? I don't know.
Well, I mean, the landscape's going to inherently change. Like if you're a landscape photographer, and you are someone that, say, like explores like the natural landscape, right? So the natural landscape's going to inherently change due to time and weather, things like that. So if you are a photographer that returns to the location multiple times over a period of years, you are going to find change. Like it's going to happen. And so you're going to find that with urban environments as well. If you're somebody that is a street photographer returning to venues, like there's plenty of work that shows that. And like there was a body of beautiful work about New Orleans post Katrina and how things have changed and shifted through then. And that's natural disaster. And so, I think what you do and I think what I do, I think there is inherent overlap because, you are studying the landscape of change.
Yeah.
So I think that, when that's part of our investigation, you're going to find it's going to happen. So you're going to see change. Change is going to be evident, and that's something that you're going to have to accept to a degree. And so,
I just keep thinking too, right? Because photography now is so ubiquitous, right? Everyone has a camera on their smartphone. Everyone is snapping shots, but yeah, I wonder if there's some way to capture change.
Well, I think that, also to counter that, I think that everybody has a computer too. And everybody has access to 3D modeling and 3D rendering. So how do you siphon through what other people create on their own as like, because there are a lot of people that are out there that fancy themselves historians to certain degrees that are trying to do some of this kind of work. Like how do you take and render something that's accurate and understand what other people are doing, and like recontextualizing it to better understand it and put it in a place that you can talk about accuracies, inaccuracies, and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, photography is the same way. Everybody has a camera. Everybody's got a cell phone. So, we have one more question. This might have to be our last question. So how is the study of change different for scholars in the future studying our modern world that are better documented through photo, video, and other media? That was a Ryan Bitsagai question.
I was just going to say, I would kill for some of this documentation for the ancient world. And like I said at the beginning, right, that's actually what got me thinking about contemporary statue landscapes was the amount of documentation that's available. I mean, it's going to be in one way a blessing and then another way a curse, because like you have to go through all of that information. Like, where do you draw the line? Like, where do you just at some point stop? Because there's just so much to sort through.
Yeah, it's interesting because, the idea of documentation, I mean, well, there's relevance for documentation, right? It's like, it's us understanding that moment, that time, and it's, trying to secure something in its place and say, this is what this is when this was. But it's interesting to think about like how everything changes over time. I mean, because monuments change over time too. Like they patina, they alter, like they're never what they once were, like the day that they were installed. And so even faces on monuments change. So I mean, it's an interesting sort of conversation to be had that, how does this change? How does this influence change too? So, yeah.
I smell collaborative projects in the future.
Well, it might be Ryan. Got some questions. Oh, so maybe we have one more question. So we're going to get through this. Not that this is difficult by any means. So in reference to digital reconstruction methods and new technology, do you feel there is a renaissance of sorts in the interest in ancient statuary amidst young scholars that you've noticed? I think the reference to gaming is a perfect example of this. Do you actually see this changing how people engage or view the ancient world?
Okay, wait, I'm trying to understand the question.
So it's two parts. Do you feel there is a renaissance in the interest in ancient statuary amidst young scholars? Like, have you seen that? And then in part with that, it's in reference to gaming. Do you see this changing how people engage or view the ancient world due to, say, something like Assassin's Creed?
So let me answer the second part first. I mean, I have a not surprising number of students who bring up Assassin's Creed to me. Oh, did you know that they have one that takes place in ancient Greece? And I think this happens, at least once a decade, where a movie comes out like Gladiator, or a game comes out like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, that sort of revives interest in the ancient world. Which I'm really happy for, and it makes students excited to take courses on the ancient world, and so that's all well and good. In terms of sort of a renaissance among younger scholars, I mean, classics in general is having a difficult moment because this is a field that has been traditionally white, and it's now, not every school has classics, right, where you learn Greek and Latin. I think my first sort of classics course was really not until I went to grad school, effectively. So I don't know that I'm seeing sort of more younger scholars than usual with an interest. I think that's sort of been steady. But what I would love to see is a greater diversity of people who are interested in studying the ancient world.
Thanks. So, Dr. Baltes, we have to wrap this up. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. I know that it was, you said that you were nervous about this, but it was excellent. I think we should do this again too. So tell us what classes you're teaching in the fall.
In the fall, I'm teaching Art History 105, which is the first half of the Art History survey. And I'm teaching Art History 211, which is Roman art and architecture. So there's only one spot left.
So if anybody wants to take it, it's there. So you should sign up. So cool. So Elizabeth, thank you. I appreciate this. And we'll have you back again to have more conversations about sculpture, portraiture, things like that.
Anytime, Easton.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. And you have a wonderful day. Folks, thanks for watching. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Baltes or myself. We do have email addresses that can be found on the university website. Other than that, thanks again, and you guys